presentation. That's probably a good thing. I don't think anything that I'm going to say today is going to surprise you when I talk about the 2019 housing market. I don't think you guys would be, I mean, it is expected that the market's not going to be really much better this year. So what I figured I would do this year is I'd actually spend a lot of time talking about why. Going into those indicators to explain why is our housing market doing what it's doing. So first of all, let's talk about what happened last year. Last year, the market was far worse than anyone had expected. Now we knew that interest rates and the lending rule changes would slow the market. We knew that would impact sales activity, and because we had oversupply, we knew this would influence prices. What we didn't expect is for it to come down as much as it did. So why did that happen? Well, first of all, the jobs never came back the way they were supposed to. So employment, we were supposed to see employment growth through the second half of last year. Unemployment rates were supposed to fall in Calgary to 6%. Well, guess what? That just did not happen. We stayed near that 8% unemployment rate. We had job losses. When you have job losses, you can't really see a lot of growth in housing demand. So that's one thing that happened. If we also think about what happened in the second half of the year, look what happened in the energy sector. There's a lot of issues that were happening that impact consumer confidence. So we saw pretty weak activity in the past year. Now, when we think about what's changed, the reality is not much. There are things that have been continuing to influence our market on the downside. The energy sector continues to have struggles. Consumer confidence is also impacted by that. We continue to struggle with employment. The lending market, those rule changes are still here. Rates are still higher. That's an adjustment for our market. And of course, we are dealing with oversupply. Now, when we think of that, the only thing that there has been some positive, the only positive has been net migration. Now, however, it hasn't been enough to offset all the things that are influencing our market on the downside. Now, I'm going to go into all these things in detail. So let's start with what the expectation is. So overall, with nothing changing, we expect further drops in sales this year, as well as further price declines. And in fact, it's going to be the fourth consecutive year of price declines in our market. Okay. Sales are going to remain weak because nothing's really changing. So what I think is important for all of you to know is what is causing these things to happen, and before the market can shift, understanding what indicators to look at. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is the energy sector. Now, if you look here, there's the green line. Okay, that green line is the WTI price. Things are starting to look good in the beginning of 2018. Well, the WTI price was fixed at around $70 a barrel. And all of a sudden, there's concerns on a global scale about too much production. And that caused WTI prices to start to drop. Now, and we came into really below $50 a barrel. Now, moving into this year, WTI prices are still expected to be somewhat range-bound, not really moving much above $54 a barrel. Now, it's better than what it was back in 2015, but this is still a decline in price, and that impacts the market. Now, if we layer onto that the blue line, which is that Western Canadian Select price, so that's what our producers generally get, this is where there was even more concerns. In fact, the price dropped to $11 a barrel by the end of last year. And that's where you heard a lot of concerns about the differential, the discounts, and what that means for our Canadian energy sector. Now, so the government did step in. They imposed production cuts that were coming into play this year, and that has helped reduce some of that differential. But it still is a sign that we're struggling. Part of it is because of market access. So we still continue to have difficulties getting approvals in pipelines. And that is one thing, we're not getting more product to market. So that's influencing our prices and our Canadian market. We still hear struggles with competitiveness in the Canadian market, as well as different policies. So a lot of the energy sectors are saying, well, it's not necessarily just about the policies that are in place, it's about the fact that they change. And the more that they change, it makes it difficult for them to make the investment decisions. So investment has fallen. To put some perspective to this, back in 2014, over $34 billion was invested in the oil sands sector. By 2018, those estimates are down to 12 billion, and they're expected to fall further this next year. So, how does this relate to housing? Well, if investment is falling, companies aren't expanding. If they're not expanding, they're not creating jobs, and that does impact housing. The next aspect to it is confidence. The energy sector is still, to this day, the most important sector in this province. And when you have prices fall, consumers get nervous because they're worried about, am I going to have a job in 6 months? What's going to happen to me? This is my lifeline. We know that the energy sector is important, so that's where that consumer confidence comes in. And it's been a struggle. Now, there was some positive news last year, very little, but the main was with regards to LNG. They said there's movement there. Now, what's the benefit to Alberta? Well, a lot of those professional technical jobs are expected to come out of Calgary. So that is something that can help, but it's not enough yet to offset all the challenges we're facing in the energy sector. So these are the things that are continuing to weigh on the market. Now, that being said, our economy is still growing. So that feels like a bit of a disconnect. We have the energy sector that struggled for the better part of 4 years, but yet we've seen our economy growing and coming back from a recession. And in fact, 2019 estimates are putting us back to the economic output that we saw in 2014. But I bet you many of you are thinking, well, this does not feel like 2014. And it is true. It's important to take it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually spend some time looking at what the differences are. Why does it feel different? Well, the first thing is, let's look at it by sector. It is true that 70% of our industries have seen GDP growth. Okay, the primary utilities, which is mostly reflected in the energy sector, that represents 33% of our economy, and that has seen growth. In fact, they have GDP growth of 9% since 2014. So how does that make sense? I thought the energy sector was contracting. Well, if we put some thought to this, it's really about production growth. So that we've seen more production in the energy sector, but that was based on investment made a decade ago. So we've seen GDP growth in that sector, but it hasn't been followed up with jobs. In fact, we've had job losses continue. There's less people working today in the energy sector than there was in 2014. If we look in provincially, when we consider the primary utilities, manufacturing and professional services, those generally reflect our energy sector in a total. Over 50,000 jobs have not come back. That's pretty significant. Now, same time, I'm sure many of you heard, but all the jobs lost were regained. That is also true. But look at the numbers. Where has there been job growth? Education, healthcare, and public administration. Those are very different jobs than what was lost. Okay? It's not jobs that have been funded through business investment. And that is some of the primary differences between the market today and versus what we saw 4 years ago. So, what's expected in Calgary this year? Well, first of all, for jobs, many of those same industries that are struggling in terms of provincial, it's the same here. We haven't had job growth in many of these areas. There's still over 20,000 jobs that have not come back in these industries. Over half of them are related to energy directly. But yet, we're supposed to see growth in 2019. How come this growth is not expected to help our market much? It really comes down to a couple of factors. The first is the type of job growth. While we're expected to see a 1% employment growth, most of those jobs are coming from wholesale trade, combination of food services, and education. And this is not from our energy sector. These are typically lower paid industries and doesn't have as much of an impact on ownership demand in housing. So that's one reason why we don't expect it to have enough of an impact in our market this year. The second reason comes down to timing. Further to that, there's still job losses happening in manufacturing and construction. That's expected this year. But again, those are higher paid industries as well. So when we look at the timing, one thing to point out, so this year shows you the year-over-year changes in employment. That's what green lines do. Take a look at what happened in 2018. It started off the first quarter, things were looking good. We started to see job growth. We started to see unemployment rates come down. That was a positive. And all of a sudden it switched. Okay. Any job growth that's expected this year is expected to happen in the last half of the year. So that's another reason that we just don't think that even if those job growth does happen, because it's not happening in the last part of the year, it's going to take some time for that to filter into the housing markets, right? It could set us up better for 2020, but it's not going to do much of an impact in 2019. We also continue to struggle with high unemployment rates, and this is something that will continue to weigh on our market. So even though there is some improvements in the second half of the year, it's just not enough to cause a shift. The next impact on our market is lending changes. Okay? And we're talking about not just the rule changes with the stress test, but also the interest rates. Okay, so again, put some perspective to this. Since 2017, we've had 5 rate increases. That's over a very short time frame. Plus, they added an additional stress test of 2%. So what does it do? Well, naturally, it affects demand. If it gets more costly to own a home, you're creating barriers to home ownership. So some first-time owners, or potential first-time homeowners, were pushed out of the market. Others had to choose different products. Yes, some just didn't get in. It also impacted the move-out buyers. Some of them might not have been able to take that next step into a higher price home because of the changes preventing them to do so. Now, in 2019, originally, there was 2 rate increases expected. Now, that's likely, I'm not sure if that's actually going to play out that way. There has been a lot of discussion that the Canadian economy will not necessarily do as well. If that happens, then you might not see both increases happen. There's been some arguments made it will only be 1 increase. But despite that, so while that might not have further downside impacts on the housing market, same time, we have this impact of these changing stress tests that's going to linger. So why is that? First of all, let's think about what happened. If somebody could afford a $500,000 home back in 2017, as soon as it hit 2018, they now, to buy that exact same home, assuming their incomes didn't drop, they would have need to put an additional $76,000 down for that same home. I don't know about you guys, but I think it takes a long time to save $76,000 if you still want that. Okay, so that is a challenge. And that's something that's going to persist. Now, granted, as prices drop, some of that spread tends to change. But another challenge that we've had is our incomes here have not improved. Our household incomes have actually declined from 2017. Now think about it. I'm sure many of you in this room know people who've either who've lost their job, which impacts their household income, or maybe had to take a job at less pay. Okay? So this is something that continues to weigh on our market, and when those things are happening, it makes it really difficult to see improvements in housing demand. There was some positive news, and I did mention it was migration. Okay, so this is the one area where we've actually seen some growth. And this was better than expected. Not too many of those things have happened. So back in 2018, we had 11,000 migrants into the city, according to the Calgary Civic Census. Now this is, originally the city had only expected about 2,000 migrants in. So this was a nice benefit. This was a nice thing to see. Now again, I'm sure many of you are asking, well, if you saw improvements in net migration, how come this didn't impact the housing market? Well, it did. It just impacted the rental side of it. Now, this shouldn't be too much of a surprise because when first people come here, they typically start in rental. The other aspect is what type of migrants were coming. Estimates from the conference board show that about 83% of those migrants were from international sources. So while this generally will help our housing market, and we're continuing to expect to see more migrants coming in this year, again, most of it due to international migration, it might not necessarily translate into ownership on a quick way. So it's going to take some time before that starts to impact ownership. But it has benefited the rental, and that is a good thing. Okay, so if I were to think of one side of the market that we're starting to see some improvements, it does come in terms of rental. We've seen those vacancy rates come down. So they moved down in 2018. Now, again, there's two factors that are impacting it, not just migration, but when you have those stricter lending conditions, it means some people are going to stay in rental longer. It's going to take longer for them to move into ownership. But either way, we're seeing this number come down. Vacancy rates are expected to drop further. And what does that do? Well, that means that there could be some opportunity for rental growth. Hasn't happened in a while, but we're starting to see it. We're starting to see rental rates improve. The benefit on the ownership side is that you're actually starting to get rid of some of this excess supply, at least in the rental market. And as that happens, and as rental rates increase, at some point, some of those renters do move into ownership. I don't think it'll have much of an impact in 2019, but again, it sets us up better as we move into 2020. So sales. Sales activity clearly has been quite weak. 2018 was really the lowest level we've seen since 1996. So there's just not been a lot of activity. Again, can't really be a surprise. You see concerns in the energy sector, you have a weak job market, changes in lending, all of these things are influencing sales. As we move into 2019, not much is changing. So we expect that to continue. But we also have to consider the supply. I would say that one thing that has been a significant struggle has been the amount of oversupply in our market. So if you have weaker sales and your inventories adjust to it or your supply adjusts to it, your market can actually still remain fairly balanced. But the problem is we just haven't had that happen. So one thing I'd like to look at is the amount of sales growth that we're seeing, or sales falling, and compare it relative to the new listings coming on the market. And the new listings just have continued to outpace what's happening in sales. And that's caused inventories to rise. So that's what that red line is. That tells us that those inventories have been trending up. Now, at the end of 2018, we did start to see some improvements in terms of listings coming off of it. And that was slowing that pace of growth of inventories, but they still generally have remained high. They're not at peak levels, they're still below those peaks, but they're still quite elevated for the market. But it's not just the inventory on the resale side, we also have to think about the inventory on the new home side. So the new home starts activity has still been fairly strong. 2018, we did see starts decline, mostly due to detached activity, because multifamily starts still increase. If we look at the amount of inventory, so that's the red line, the amount of inventory in the market reached record levels. Most of that is apartment condominium. Okay. 70% of that inventory is on multifamily side. Okay, so that includes all the rental and agricultural, not rental, actually, mostly just apartment and detached product. Okay. Now, in terms of, it's going to take some time to work through that inventory. We have to see those numbers come down before we see more stability. The next aspect is we still have over 11,000 units under construction. So that's what's going to be coming on the market in the next so many years. We have to work through those inventory levels, and we have to start to see that adjustment to slower sales activity. So that is going to take time. So I'd like to look at the months of supply. So why is that? Well, the months of supply really give us that indication of, are we in a buyer's market, sellers, balanced, whatever it might be. We have seen really over the past 4 years that months of supply measure increase. So that just means that there's more supply than demand. Well, what happens? Naturally, that impacts prices. The more supply that you have, and the less demand that there is, you can't have prices increasing when that happens. And those numbers have been rising. And again, it's not just because of the resale supply. You have to think of all those other choices that consumers have. That makes it a bit of a challenge. So, and we've seen this happen with prices. Prices have been coming down since really the high in 2014. Now, they're not as low as they were at the bottom of the market, so they've come off. They're still, it's not like they dropped below the lows that we've seen. But you have to give some perspective to that, and it's because of this months of supply. Now, as we move into this year, expect really for the majority of the year, we're going to see these buyer market conditions persist. So with that comes further price declines. So we should put the price declines in some perspective. Now this is city residential numbers, so it doesn't break it out by property type. I will get there. But what we've seen happen is that really from peak levels, with the declines expected this year, that's a 9% adjustment in price. Okay. Once again, it's not at the lows. So if you're dealing with clients, one thing I've often said is, it's important to understand where they came into this market. Did they come in at the high in 2014? Did they come into a different cycle? Because that will influence really what's happened to them. Because even though prices have declined over this time frame, it really, like, if you didn't buy in 2014, you might not be facing that same sort of adjustment on your home. Okay, so it's always good to keep some perspective with that. Product type does differ. So one thing I wanted to point out, the green here shows you the months of supply on Marta. That sector has faced the most adjustment out of all of them. It went into oversupply conditions basically at the beginning of 2015. And things really just only kind of progressed and got worse as we moved through. So it's been oversupplied for 4 years. No surprise that the prices have fallen the most in that sector. The attached sector has been somewhere in the middle. The detached is the one that I find, it is the bulk of our product, and this is where we've seen some interesting dynamics. So it took longer for it to get oversupplied, so we started to see that happen in 2015, near the end of the year, as the economic conditions really continued to weigh on the market. 2016, oversupply, but not as bad as what we saw in the apartment sector, or even in the attached sector. 2017 actually started to look like it improved. We thought we were out of this until we had all these changes happen. And then 2018, we really saw a shift. Now that is in part because you have lending rule changes which impact the higher prices of the market. Okay, so that's the area, that's the segment that we've seen that impact most, really in the detached sector. So you have this oversupply. All three categories. It's going to take time for these numbers to come back down, especially if you don't have enough of an improvement in sales to help reduce the inventory levels. So what's been the price adjustment? And why do we measure from 2014? Well, we like to look at it really on a cycle basis. Where were we at the peaks, where were we at the troughs, and how do we look from there? Well, again, because we've had 4 years of this, we've seen price declines that have ranged from highs, 7% in the detached, to 17% in the apartment. Those are some significant price adjustments. And again, it's because of the oversupply. And we just don't see change happening this year. It's going to take some time. In fact, we think some of those price declines will be more steep this year, with the market being as oversupplied as it is. Now, that being said, there will be different dynamics as we move through the year. I would expect that the first quarter of this year into the second quarter will be far worse than what we see at the end of the year. And it's because we're expecting to see stronger job declines in the first portion of this year. That impacts confidence as well. And think about it, even though there are people who are employed, if you are concerned about what your job prospects look like in 6 months, or you're concerned about, are you going to get a reduced salary or something's going to happen, what's your willingness to purchase a home?
No, that's fine.
That can help. Alright, so that is a challenge that we continue to face. And it's hard to get consumers to shift that aspect because if you're worried about your job, you're just not going to want to take that step. So prices are reacting to that because if you don't have a lot of buyers out there, you still have the supply, prices have to rise. Now, in fairness, as prices do start to adjust, that tends to bring back buyers if the prices come down enough. And I think that we might start to see some of that transition as we move into the later portion of the year. With that, I'd have to say it also varies by area. To put in perspective, I said that we saw the detached, that adjustment from peak was 7% and apartment was 17%. If we look at it based on district, that adjustment has ranged from peak from down 1% to down 20%. So when you guys are dealing with your clients, I'd say it's nice to look at the overall trends, but really when it comes to that house or that product you're dealing with, you need to understand what's happening in that location, as well as some of those dynamics with that product type, what price range you're in. The only area that we saw improvements in sales last year were in the lowest price ranges of every product type. So I don't think that this market is a little different where you'll have different trends depending on your product type and depending on the price range. Now that being said, you also should be aware of how much inventory there is, not just on the resale side, but also on the new home side. The areas with the most price adjustment have tended to be the areas where there is the most supply from both of those sources. The city center is a bit of an exception for various different reasons. Some of that is because there's not really a lot of detached product in the city center, but there's a lot more apartment. So you have to look at some of those factors. The same is true when you look at surrounding areas. Okay, so surrounding area dynamics can be really different. Now, one thing that I've seen that's the same is all of them have had sales activity falling, inventory is rising, and oversupply conditions. But it's not just about it being an oversupply, it's about how long. One thing that was kind of confusing me through this past year was that prices were kind of stable in Okotoks and Cochrane. Prices actually increased a bit in Okotoks, and that caused me to scratch my head a bit. I'm like, why is that happening? Well, when you look at it, it took longer for that market to go into an oversupplied scenario. So it's not just about is it oversupplied, it's about how long is it oversupplied for. Because the longer that the market has too much supply, the more of an impact it has on pricing. Okay, and we are starting to see it in some of these markets where their prices are also starting to trend down. Okay, risks. Now I'm sure all of you have sitting there, looked at the forecast for this year, and some of you are saying, well, I think sales will drop more. Some of you might say that sales aren't going to drop. Some of you are thinking prices are going to drop more. I think you are clearly identifying that based off your assumptions of what's going to happen. Economists like to call that forecast risk or insurance. These things don't work out that way. So when any forecast that comes out, I always say it's really important to understand the assumptions behind them. And when those things change, the market will change. So if I see a shift in employment, positive or negative, that will change my assumptions on what's happening in the market. Now, in terms of employment, I think most of the risk is on the downside. Unfortunately, I just don't think I expect to see this immediate shift in employment. If I think back to last year when I talked to you guys, employment was also supposed to increase in the second half of the year, and that didn't happen. So this is one of those numbers that I watch very closely, because it can impact the confidence as well as obviously the housing market. So that's one area. Any change in the energy sector will influence confidence in this market. We know that investment will continue to struggle. I don't think that's going to shift anytime soon, but any positive news in pipelines can help. Right? That can just help the situation. Again, that's up in the air. Who knows what's going to happen with that? I mean, currently, we have to build in just the expectations that knowledge is going to change. And that influences confidence. And I can guarantee you, consumer confidence in this market, look at that WTI price or the energy prices, and that reflects your confidence in the market. When the prices are going up, everybody's feeling good. Those prices come down, everyone gets scared. And it's because of the importance of the energy sector to our economy. Now, government is another interesting one. We know that we have elections this year. That can influence things. Now, as far as what happens with government, I'm more concerned about policy implications. So what policies are going to come into play that can influence the market conditions? Because really, it's the market conditions that will drive the housing market. So I'm more curious as to what will impact consumers and business investment, because that will influence housing markets moving forward, because it's all about employment, right? And that's a big unknown. We don't know what will come through and how long it'll take to see those policies actually filter through into our market. As I said before, interest rates, they may not increase that much, but we have still that lagging impact on the real changes. Now again, further adjustments to policies in the lending market, that happens all the time. So we continue to watch to see what changes might happen, what further announcements could happen that can cause shifts in that. And that's something that we'll be looking for moving forward. I wanted to leave lots of time for questions, so thank you. And Alan's going to come up and hopefully ask some questions.